Hello again, everyone. So for this video, we're going to look at the emergence of an anti-war majority in the United States. Um, and we're going to, in the process of looking at how the public in the United States eventually turns against the war in Vietnam, we're going to look at how that played out versus how it is perceived in popular culture. Now, and this was particularly true in the 1980s. There has long been a trend in American movies that depict the war in Vietnam or address it in some way to either blame American defeat in the war in Vietnam not on a poorly thought out strategy or just the simple fact that the U.S. had no business in fighting that war, but rather on the idea that, you know, American GIs at the front were betrayed by anti war protesters at home. This is perhaps most famously and directly addressed in the 1985 action movie Rambo First Blood Part 2, where the title character goes up to his commanding officer and says, "Sir, will they let us win this time?" And so this is a very common motif in popular culture, the idea that the anti-war movement was comprised entirely of, spoiled rich college students, which it was not, and that ultimately a lack of faith and commitment on the part of the American people doomed the American war effort in Vietnam, not poor strategy or any other factor. Ultimately, both of those are very common tropes, but also very popular myths in American popular culture that have served various political ends in the time since. But they don't really reflect the actual circumstances of what happened in the United States between 1965 and 1968. We'll save the discussion of 1968 for its own video because it's pretty significant. It's a pretty significant year in American history. So we'll leave events after 1968 to their own thing. But anyway, the actual root of opposition to the war in Vietnam is actually much more mundane than is oftentimes portrayed. Yes, you do have some rather large and very high profile protests, and yes, you definitely did have an element within the anti war movement that said and did a lot of uh, not so great things when it came to the way that they talked about American servicemen. But the general portrayal of the movement is largely inaccurate. In actuality, the anti-war movement in the United States, which did first emerge on college campuses, um, would in time actually end up becoming one of the largest and most diverse social movements in all of American history, and would involve people from all walks of life, all political persuasions, all religious backgrounds, and this is another factor that's oftentimes not accurately portrayed in how the opposition to the war is portrayed in popular culture, would consist of people from all age groups. Um, so, how does all this end up happening? Well, when the Americanization of the war in Vietnam begins in 1965, it actually is very popular. In the early phases of the war in Vietnam, the war is very popular, and Johnson enjoys high approval ratings because of his handling of the war in Vietnam. Um, and as a result, in the early phase of the war becoming a truly American war, opposition is fairly limited to those who tend to fall on the more radical fringe of American politics and American activist circles. But it doesn't take very long for that dynamic to change rather dramatically and for opposition to the war to manifest in many different circles of American life. So, where does organized opposition to the war begin? Well, it does begin on college campuses. So that part of that kind of general portrayal is, at least in that aspect, accurate. It does begin on college campuses. The first big protests against the war, in fact, are actually held on a college campus at the University of Michigan in 1965, when faculty members organize a teach-in to which it takes its name obviously from the sit-in protests in the civil rights movement. A lot of support for the anti-war movement, in fact, initially draws quite heavily from those who had engaged in civil rights activism, such as individuals who belong to what would become the largest anti-war organization of the time period, Students for a Democratic Society, which had been formed in 1962 to focus on a variety of um, different political civil rights objectives, and to engage students in a variety of different types of activism. After 1965, SDS becomes solely focused on anti-war activism and would ultimately become one of the largest anti-war organizations in the country, with more than 100,000 members in chapters nationwide. Now, contrary again to the popular depiction of student activists in movies on television, uh, many of these activists were not, in fact, you know, drug smoking hippies or anything like that. The counterculture that emerges during the same time period is, in fact, something that is kind of distinct from the anti-war movement. There is limited intersection between the counterculture and the anti-war movement, but generally speaking, the counterculture, which becomes the principal social criticism of the anti-war movement, actually drains energies away from the anti-war movement rather than fueling it. The 1960s counterculture, which very heavily focuses on sexual liberation and recreational drug use, actually uh, largely takes energies away from the anti-war movement than adding to it. It actually weakens it, if anything. But anyway, so SDS becomes this very large anti-war organization in the United States, operates on many college campuses of all varieties throughout the United States, and it principally is focused on anti-war activism. Now, some activists in the organization, like most notably one of its leaders, Tom Hayden, are hardcore revolutionaries, Maoists, and what have you, um, who really support a revolutionary change and actually actively cheer for the Viet Cong and Ho Chi Minh and groups like that, which is, of course, one of the things that ends up in the long run becoming a source of propaganda that's used against them. But by and large, that's a description that only applies to a small minority of anti-war activists. Many anti-war activists are motivated by much more simple and much more mundane motivations. They view the war as either unwise or unjust, or they think it's being prosecuted improperly, or some combination of the three, and they oppose the war for those reasons. Now, initially, most of the general public does support the war, and anti-war opposition is relatively confined to those groups, radical groups like SDS and others that operate on college campuses. But it doesn't take very long for anti-war activism to really grow mainstream. Um, and a big part of the reason is because of the way the war is fought, and moreover, because of the way that the public learns about the war and how it is being fought. Um, as I mentioned in a previous video, the basic strategy for the United States in waging the war in Vietnam is this strategy of pacification or search and destroy that aims to cripple the Viet Cong. And the principal metric of measuring victory in that strategy are these body counts and kill ratios of dead Viet Cong or North Vietnamese Army troops versus the numbers of American casualties. Well, that's there's an inherent flaw with that basic idea, and it's pretty apparent when you look at it with any basic common sense. Um, Building a military strategy around a war of attrition, where the idea is your enemy suffers higher losses than you do, assumes a certain degree of acceptable losses on your side's part. And the problem is that many Americans increasingly are unwilling to, they're not willing to lose the number of people that that way of measuring victory, which is itself deeply flawed for a whole litany of reasons that I've already covered quite extensively. Um, but the basic assumption behind it, that the American people would tolerate, large numbers of American soldiers being killed or wounded, so long as a much higher number of Viet Cong or NVA soldiers were being killed or wounded. Um, you know, that's a pretty bold assumption to make. And I think one senator who spoke with General Westmoreland summed it up best. Um, Westy, the American people don't care about the 20 or the 20,000, they care about the one. And that was fundamentally, for many Americans, what it became about. That our losses, our week to week losses, which by 1967 numbered as many as 200 Americans being killed a week in Vietnam. Um, it just wasn't acceptable. Beyond that, beyond that was the fact that those losses fell disproportionately on some parts of the population while largely excluding others. Contrary again to the popular image of the anti-war movement as being the sole refuge of the draft dodger. The reality is that many of those who supported the war were more likely to find various means of avoiding the draft and avoiding fighting in the war, um, including some pretty well-known politicians. I'm sure I don't need to name them for you. But basically, you know, draft avoidance was something that was available to white upper and middle class Americans. It wasn't available to Americans who were from poor and working class or minority backgrounds who had limited access to things like college deferments or finding jobs in defense plants or finding a friendly doctor who would give them some sort of you know um, thing that would disqualify them from military service, like bone spurs or something like that, just to use an example. Um, so the war is a class war. 80% of the Americans who fight in Vietnam are not only incredibly young compared to those who fought in earlier wars like World War II. The average age of the typical American infantryman in Vietnam is 19, whereas the typical age of the typical American infantryman in World War II was 26. But also, you don't see America represented on the battlefield in Vietnam the way you did in World War II. In Vietnam, there's lots of kids from steel towns. There's lots of kids from farming towns. There's lots of kids from working class neighborhoods in big American cities. There's not a lot of kids from those suburban areas of the country. There's not a lot of kids who come from or whose parents can send them to Ivy League schools or things like that. So one of the factors that contributes a lot to anti-war sentiment is again the fact that it's fundamentally unfair how the burden of shouldering the war is you know is divvied out amongst people in the United States. Um, But beyond that, and that also, like I said, has racial dynamics too. African Americans are disproportionately included in the numbers of killed and wounded in the early phases of the war, at a much higher level than their white counterparts. They continue to be drafted at a much higher level than white middle class Americans. Um, and so, but you also get, in addition to that, lots of opposition from faith groups. Um, Many churches come to oppose the war for various reasons, various moral reasons. Um, in some cases, this is actual churches themselves speaking out against the war, as the case with America's Jewish community, or in many instances, it's individual clergymen and lay people um, speaking out and acting out against the war, as was the case with the Catholic priests, the Berrigan brothers, Philip and Daniel Berrigan, who engaged in a number of very high-profile protests, burning down um, draft draft registration files and what have you. So again, lots of opposition from lots of different people, but it becomes more mainstream after 1965 for two big reasons. One is the coverage of the war. As I mentioned previously, many Americans come to oppose the war in Vietnam because they actually are witnessing the war to an extent with their own eyes. The Vietnam War is called the Living Room War, and the media coverage of the war is, as I previously detailed here, rather extensive, and it generally is very uncensored. People see unfiltered images of maimed and charred bodies of American troops being evacuated with grievous injuries to field hospitals, of villages being burnt down by American troops as part of the search and destroy missions and what have you. And so the imagery of the war, it juxtaposes quite significantly and differs quite significantly with the official narrative of the war, um, that is brought to the American people by individuals um, like General Westmoreland and Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara and President Johnson himself. And so, that credibility gap, as it comes to be known, grows and grows over time. Um, and eventually, it isn't just limited to the media or prominent, public figures like Muhammad Ali or, Dr. Benjamin Spock, or various others speaking out against the war. Eventually, many within government themselves begin to question the legitimacy of the American war effort, and as well as the rationality of it. Um, it's worth noting that when the United States decided to turn Vietnam into an Americanized conflict, none of our major NATO allies chose to join us. The British sat out the conflict. Of course, the French had already been defeated in Vietnam in the 1950s. The only countries that joined the American military effort in Vietnam were Australia, New Zealand, um, South Korea, and uh, and of course South Vietnam. So none of our major allies thought our strategy in Vietnam made a lot of sense. And there were within the administration itself many people who increasingly felt, well, this might not be the best idea. This might not be the best way for us to challenge the Soviet Union or to wage the Cold War. And so those voices initially were confined to relatively small number of people within the administration, people like George Ball, who openly criticized the Americanization of the Vietnam War, even as far back as the Kennedy administration, and it actually quite accurately predicted that by 1967 the U.S. would have more than 250,000 troops stuck in Vietnam, and that the war would have ground into a bloody stalemate. By 1966, there are many people in government who are beginning to be willing, many of whom initially supported the war, who are willing to say the quiet part out loud, that the war is a mistake. And one of the most effective means to that end comes in early 1966, when Senator William Fulbright of Arkansas, who up to that point had been one of Lyndon Johnson's closest and tightest allies, uh, he holds these hearings for the for the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and basically he calls a litany of experts to testify. One of the experts that he testifies and who criticizes the American strategy in Vietnam and the validity of the whole domino theory, everything, is George Kennan, the man who had actually dreamed up the containment policy. So by 1966, you get a opposition to the war that isn't just limited to a handful of radical activists who may or may not be engaging in, activities that people consider, or saying things that people consider questionable. You see an anti-war movement that comes from a lot of high-profile public figures, people with a strong background in foreign policy, people within the government, people within the political system who increasingly, kind of challenge why the Johnson administration had chosen this path. Now, Johnson initially is very hostile to any of this. He comes to feel very besieged, and to that end, he reacts and lashes out at anti-war critics. He actually has the FBI under J. Edgar Hoover, um, tap the phones of and begin investigating a lot of anti-war activists for various, ties or, engaging in various types of activities that he can try to get them on. And even more dramatically, the CIA, which by law is forbidden from conducting, any sort of activities on American soil domestically, launches its own campaign called Operation Chaos, where they try to infiltrate anti-war organizations, put in place agents provocateurs who are going to say and do outlandish things. These are more often than not the people that you see who are, saying terrible things to about American GIs, or waving the Viet Cong flag, or cheerleading Ho Chi Minh and what have you. And so there's this massive campaign to try to discredit the anti-war movement by the Johnson administration. But ultimately, by 1967, in spite of his best efforts, in spite of everything that he tries to do, many of which are things that are illegal, like, again, having the nation's covert espionage agency engaging in domestic surveillance and domestic, um, counter, um, you know, counteractive activities and what have you. Um, in spite of all that, public sentiment for the war gradually erodes. In 1965, a majority of Americans support the war. By 1967, that number slips considerably. Now, in addition to the factors I mentioned previously, the growing chorus of public figures and people in the political system who increasingly are skeptical of the war, the growing disconnect, the growing credibility gap between what the Johnson administration is saying is happening in the war and what people are actually seeing with their own eyes every night when they tune in the nightly news. In spite of the ever growing size of protests that are being mounted, such as the 1967 protest at the Pentagon, which draws over 100,000 people to the nation's capital. In spite of all these things, one of the things that really finally tips the scale for public support versus public opposition for the Vietnam War is something thoroughly mundane: taxes. Basically, when the war began, Lyndon Johnson really wanted to maintain a high level of public support for the war. And so, to that end, he refused to raise taxes to fight the war. And so, to finance the war, what Lyndon Johnson did is he basically, did the old robbing Peter to pay Paul trick. He diverted funds from various programs within the government, including in many cases his own Great Society domestic reforms, and he redirected them to the military effort in Vietnam. But by 1967, by which point there's again over 300,000 American troops stationed in Vietnam, and more than 17,000 Americans have been killed with no visible evidence of this having produced any positive result. The government begins to be stretched thin, and funding begins to really become an issue. And so Johnson eventually raises taxes to try to finance this continued war in Vietnam. And it's really only at that point, when Johnson raises taxes to fight the war in Vietnam, that a plurality of Americans begin voicing opposition. Now, that comes in late 1967. So by late 1967, already public support for the war is faltering. But within the next 2 months, within the first 2 months of 1968, events will transpire that will turn opposition to the war in Vietnam from a mere plurality into an outright majority. Events that would eventually fundamentally reshape the nature of the war in Vietnam, and which would ultimately fundamentally reshape the nature of American politics in 1968, which is what we'll talk about in our next series of videos.